Emily went camping with Jake, but something terrible happened, and the boss had to intervene. Subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. The rain pounded on the tent roof with an intensity that Emily Johnson had never witnessed before. At 28, she considered herself an organized person, planning every detail of her life with the precision of someone who learned early on that stability was the most precious asset one could have. So, when she accepted Jake's invitation to camp in Yosemite National Park, she had obsessively researched the weather, the trails, and even the phases of the moon. What she couldn't foresee was the storm that was now turning her romantic weekend into a true nightmare. "Jake, can you hear that?" she shouted, trying to make herself heard above the deafening noise of the water pouring down, as if the sky had completely opened up. Emily stretched her arm to the right side of the tent, where Jake should have been sleeping, but found only the wet fabric of an empty sleeping bag. The young administrative assistant at TechCorp, one of the largest technology companies in New York, felt the first pang in her chest. Jake was a heavy sleeper. She knew this from the 3 months they had been getting to know each other, but it was unusual for him to simply disappear in the middle of the night, especially during a storm like this. "Jake, where are you?" Her voice was lost in the roar of the furious nature. Emily fumbled around looking for her phone, but the screen remained black. No signal, no battery, exactly the opposite of what someone like her, addicted to control and predictability, could endure. It was then that she felt it. The tent began to move. First, it was a gentle sway, almost imperceptible. Then, a stronger pull that made her roll to the side. The sound of the water was no longer just from above. It was around her, rising, approaching like a hungry beast, ready to devour everything in its path. "Oh my God, it's a flash flood!" Emily struggled to open the tent zipper, but the force of the water was already carrying her downhill. Her 5 years of swimming at the Brooklyn Club, where she grew up, hadn't prepared her to swim in a muddy current filled with branches and stones. The tent fabric ripped and she found herself free, but completely at the mercy of nature. The icy water penetrated her clothes instantly, stealing her breath and any ability to think rationally. Emily clung to a log that floated by her side, her fingers slipping on the wet bark as she tried to orient herself in the absolute darkness. The rain lashed her face so hard that it was impossible to keep her eyes open for more than a few seconds. "Help! Someone help me!" she screamed until she felt her throat scratch, knowing her words were lost. In the chaos, the thought of Jake tormented her. Where was he? Had he managed to take shelter? Had he abandoned her on purpose? This last possibility, as absurd as it seemed amidst the struggle for survival, planted a seed of distrust in her mind. Jake had insisted so much on coming camping, specifically to this isolated location, away from the main trails. At the time, she interpreted it as romanticism. Now, clinging to a log in the middle of a flood, she began to question whether she had been naive. The current dragged her for at least 15 minutes, or maybe it was hours. It was impossible to have a sense of time in those circumstances until she managed to grab onto a larger rock and, with great effort, drag herself to a small rise of earth. Trembling uncontrollably, Emily huddled against a sturdy tree and waited for dawn. When the first rays of sunlight cut through the heavy clouds, she could finally assess the extent of the disaster. The spot where they had set up camp the night before was completely unrecognizable. The low vegetation had been torn away, leaving only bare earth and scattered stones. There was no trace of Jake, his backpacks, or anything that proved they had actually been there. "Jake! Jake!" Her voice echoed through the silent park, receiving only the morning song of robins in response. Emily began to walk in the direction she believed was the exit of the park, her hiking shoes making a squelching noise with each step in the mud. Her outfit, a running shirt and leggings she had carefully chosen to look stylish but not sloppy, was completely ruined, covered in mud and torn in several places. She was the type of person who always carried a first aid kit, extra sunscreen, and even backup granola bars. Her mother, Mrs. Johnson, always said, "Honey, life teaches us to be prepared for the unexpected." But nothing had prepared her for this. After 3 hours of walking, Emily finally found a familiar trail that would lead her back to the visitor center. Each step was a struggle against physical exhaustion and the whirlwind of emotions swirling in her chest. Anger began to overshadow fear. How could Jake simply disappear without a trace? And why did she feel, deep down, as if she had been deliberately abandoned? When she reached the park's parking lot, Emily discovered that Jake's car, a black Civic she had admired so many times, was no longer there. Reality hit her like a punch in the stomach. Jake had left. He had abandoned her in the middle of a devastating storm, without explanation, without caring whether she was alive or dead. Sitting on the curb of the almost empty parking lot, with only a few curious and concerned visitors watching her, Emily Johnson cried for the first time in years, not just for the betrayal, but for the realization that her ability to trust people had been completely shattered that terrible morning. What she still didn't know was, in that moment of despair and abandonment, Emily Johnson realized it would only be the first of a series of revelations that would completely shake the foundations of the life she had carefully built over the past 5 years. 3 weeks after the nightmare in Yosemite National Park, Emily still felt a knot in her stomach every time she heard the sound of rain tapping against the window of her apartment in East Village, the small studio she shared with her cat. Pandora had become a refuge where she tried to process what had happened, but sleepless nights multiplied, and her performance at work began to draw attention for all the wrong reasons. "Emily, are you okay? You look like you've seen a ghost," commented Letitia, her best friend and colleague from the Human Resources Department at TechCorp, as she watched Emily absent-mindedly stir the salad she had ordered from the company cafeteria. "I'm just processing some things," Emily replied, avoiding her friend's concerned gaze. She hadn't told anyone about Jake's abandonment. It was too humiliating to admit that she had been left to fend for herself in the middle of a storm by someone who, just hours before, had whispered promises of a future together. TechCorp occupied 3 floors of a modern building on Faria Lima, with glass walls offering a stunning view of the bustling metropolis. Emily worked on the 15th floor in the administrative department, where her efficiency and attention to detail had made her indispensable over her 5-year career at the company. She knew every process, every system, every quirk of the contracts. She managed with the precision of someone who found security in routine. "Emily Johnson, please. Report to the CEO's office immediately." The receptionist's voice echoed through the internal sound system, causing several heads to turn in her direction. In 5 years at the company, Emily had never been called to the CEO's office. "Wow, what did you do?" joked Letitia, but Emily sensed a hint of genuine concern in her friend's tone. David Smith ran TechCorp as an extension of his own personality, determined, innovative, and absolutely inflexible when it came to results. At 35, he had transformed the family business into one of the leading providers of technological solutions in the country. But he had paid a high price for that success. Divorced for 2 years, with no children, David lived for the company in a way that even worried his closest partners. When Emily knocked on the door of the CEO's office, her hands trembled slightly. The room was imposing, with Italian designer furniture and a panoramic view of the city stretching all the way to the mountains on clear days. David stood behind his mahogany desk, but he was not alone. "Emily, please have a seat." His voice was deep and controlled, but she detected an unusual tension. "This is Investigator Michael Harris from Total Security. He needs to ask you some questions about your recent personal life." The man next to David was burly, around 50, wearing a grey suit that had seen better days. His small, penetrating eyes studied Emily with the intensity of someone accustomed to uncovering secrets. "Miss Johnson," Michael opened a yellowed folder, "do you know a man named Jake Mendez?" The name hit Emily like a dagger. She felt the blood drain from her face and her hands clenched involuntarily. Yes, we dated. Why?" "Jake Mendez is not who he claimed to be," Michael continued, relentlessly. "His real name is Robert Fields, a private investigator specializing in industrial espionage. For the past 4 months, he has been working for Apex Innovations with the specific goal of obtaining confidential information from TechCorp." Emily's world seemed to collapse for the second time in 3 weeks. She looked at David, who was observing the entire scene with a grim expression. This is impossible," she stammered. "We met at a cafe. It was casual. He didn't even know where I worked at first." "Nothing was casual, Miss Johnson." Michael flipped through some papers. "He followed you for 2 weeks, studied your routine, your habits, even your musical preferences, through your social media. The goal was to get close to you, to access the information you manage." "What information?" Emily's voice came out louder than she intended. "I work with administrative contracts. I don't have access to any industrial secrets." David moved for the first time since she entered the room, walking to the window with his hands clasped behind his back. "Emily, you have had access to the company's central document system for 3 years. You process contracts with suppliers, read technical specifications, and have knowledge of our clients and their projects." His voice was careful, but she sensed an implicit accusation. "Are you insinuating that I passed information to him?" Emily stood up abruptly, feeling a mix of anger and betrayal that made her dizzy. "I would never do that. This company is my life." "I believe you didn't do it consciously." David turned to face her, and for the first time, Emily noticed that his brown eyes revealed more fatigue than anger. "But we need to understand exactly what Jake was able to access through you." Michael consulted his notes again. "Miss Johnson, how many times has Mr. Jake been to your home in the last 3 months?" I don't know, several times. Why does that matter?" "Because we found electronic surveillance equipment in his apartment. Micro cameras, audio recording devices, computer cloning programs. He photographed documents you took home, recorded phone conversations you had with colleagues, copied files from your personal laptop." Emily sat down heavily, feeling nauseous. Every intimate moment they had shared, every casual conversation about work, every time she had mentioned a project or a client, everything had been calculated and recorded. "The trip to Yosemite," she whispered. "It was a way to keep you away from San Francisco while they infiltrated the company's systems using your access data," David completed. "What we can't understand is why he left her there." Michael closed the folder with a sharp snap. "Probably because he found out we were investigating. Jake Mendez, or rather Robert Fields, has completely vanished. He hasn't returned to his apartment, hasn't contacted his employers at Apex Innovations. He just evaporated." "And left me to die," Emily murmured, more to herself than to the men in the room. David walked over to her, and for the first time since they met, Emily saw something beyond professional coldness in his eyes. "Emily, I need you to understand one thing. You are not suspected of complicity. You are a victim. But now we need your help to figure out exactly what was compromised and how we can minimize the damage." "How can I help?" Her voice came out weak, almost inaudible. I need you to try to remember every conversation, every document he might have seen, every piece of information that might have slipped by without you noticing. No matter how small it seems, it could be crucial. Emily looked at the two men, feeling the weight of a responsibility she never asked for. Her orderly and predictable life had transformed into something unrecognizable, and she was still trying to process that the man she thought she loved was, in fact, a stranger paid to manipulate her. "I will help," she finally said, surprising herself with the firmness in her own voice. "I will remember everything." April arrived in New York City with its traditional explosion of colors. The yellow tulips lining the streets bloomed in all their glory, turning Emily's commute to the office into a spectacle that, under other circumstances, would have filled her eyes with joy. But that autumn, every golden petal falling from the trees only accentuated the melancholy that had settled in her life since the discovery about Jake. It had been 2 weeks since David created a special room on the 20th floor of TechCorp, away from the curious eyes of other employees, where Emily worked directly with him and Michael on the investigation. The room was Spartan, a conference table, 4 chairs, 2 computers, and endless stacks of documents that needed to be analyzed. The white walls and cold lighting created an environment that felt more like an interrogation room than an office. "Emily, I need you to look at these contracts again." David pushed a folder in her direction, his fingers brushing against hers accidentally. The brief touch made them both pull away quickly, as if an electric current had passed between them. "These are the agreements with SteelTech from the last 6 months. Do you remember mentioning anything about them to Jake?" Emily took the folder, but her hands trembled slightly. In the past few days, she had developed a disturbing ability to remember conversations with photographic detail. It was as if her brain, in response to the trauma of betrayal, had unlocked a capacity that had always been there, but that she had carefully hidden. "I remember," she said, closing her eyes for a moment. "It was a Friday, March 15th. We were having pizza at his apartment. I had worked late because the SteelTech contracts had a strange clause about exclusivity for supplying components for military projects. I mentioned that it was unusual for a company our size to have access to that kind of technology." David and Michael exchanged meaningful glances. "What else did you say about it?" Michael jotted down notes quickly in his notepad. "Jake asked if I knew what the specific components were. I said I didn't have access to that technical information, that my job was just to process the administrative parts of the contract." Emily opened her eyes, finding David's intense gaze fixed on her. "But I also mentioned that I found it strange that the project had the codename Golden Eagle, because usually our projects have more commercial names." "My God." David ran his hand through his dark hair, messing up his usually impeccable hairstyle. "Golden Eagle is a classified military project. If that information reached Apex Innovations—" "David," Michael interrupted, "we need to talk about something I discovered yesterday." He opened his laptop and turned the screen so they could both see. Apex Innovations has 3 female employees in the administrative department. One of them has a very specific gift. On the screen appeared a photo of a blonde woman around 40 years old with piercing blue eyes and an intelligent expression. Amanda Smith, a psychology graduate specialized in hypermnesia. She can teach people to develop almost photographic memory capabilities. Michael looked directly at Emily. "Are you sure you've always had this ability to remember conversations with such detail?" Emily felt a shiver run down her spine. "I have always had a good memory, since childhood, but it has never been so precise." "It's possible that Jake applied specific techniques to stimulate and direct your natural memory." David stood up and began to walk around the room, as he always did when formulating a theory. "If he managed to make you remember more details than you would naturally recall." He used me in a way that was even deeper than we imagined, Emily finished, feeling nauseous again. With each revelation, the violation of her intimacy became more sinister, more calculated. David stopped walking and positioned himself behind her chair, his hands resting on the back. Emily could feel the warmth of his presence and the subtle scent of his cologne, something woody that contrasted completely with the sweet fragrance Jake used to wear. "Emily, I know this is hard to hear, but your memory could be our only advantage in this investigation." His voice was softer than usual, almost protective. "If you can remember other information you might have shared, we might be able to understand the true extent of the leak." "And what if I don't want to remember?" The question came out more vulnerable than she intended. "What if I just want to forget that Jake existed and go back to my normal life?" David walked to stand in front of her, crouching down so their eyes were at the same level. For the first time since they met, Emily saw beyond the mask of the successful CEO. There was fatigue in his eyes, but also a fierce determination that made her feel strangely secure. "Because our company is not just a business, Emily. We are a family, and when someone attacks our family, we defend ourselves." He hesitated for a moment, as if struggling with something internally. "And because I feel responsible for you being put in this situation. Jake chose you because you work here. That makes your pain in part my responsibility." Michael watched their interaction with professional interest, taking notes that seemed unrelated to the investigation. "There's one more thing," Michael said, breaking the moment. "We managed to track some of Jake's activities over the past few months. He didn't work alone. There are at least 3 people involved in this scheme, and one of them may be within TechCorp itself." "That's impossible!" Emily stood up abruptly. "I've known everyone who works here for years. They are honest, dedicated people." "Emily," David gently held her arm, preventing her from continuing to pace the room. "You also thought you knew Jake." The phrase cut through the air like a sharp blade. Emily felt tears burning her eyes, but she refused to let them fall in front of the 2 men. Her ability to trust people had been systematically destroyed, and now even the workplace she considered safe was not free from suspicion. "Who do you suspect?" she asked, forcing her voice to remain steady. "We are still investigating," Michael replied evasively. "But the person has access to the same systems as you, knows your routines, and would have the ability to guide Jake on how to approach you convincingly." "You're talking about someone close to me." It wasn't a question, it was a statement. Emily felt as if she was falling back into that torrent, but this time the water dragging her down was made of betrayal and distrust. David released her arm and walked to the window, watching the city's movement below. The afternoon was advancing, and the lights of the neighboring buildings were beginning to turn on, creating an urban mosaic that usually calmed him. Today, it only accentuated his sense of isolation. "Emily, I want you to know that, regardless of what we discover, you are not alone in this situation." His voice reached her, laden with an emotion she couldn't fully identify. "We will find out who did this to you, and we will seek justice." Tuesday, May 7th, began like any other normal day in Emily's life, but it would end as the worst of her professional career. She had woken up at 6 in the morning, prepared her coffee with milk and French bread with butter, the same comforting routine she had maintained for 5 years, and arrived at the office promptly at 8 o'clock. What she didn't expect was to find Sarah waiting for her in the entrance hall with an expression that mixed pity and embarrassment. "Emily, I need to talk to you before you go up." Sarah pulled her to a discreet corner near the elevators, away from the curious ears of other employees arriving for another day of work. "Sarah, you're scaring me. What happened?" "Mr. Fields from management approached me yesterday at the end of the day. They think you leaked confidential information to outsiders." Sarah couldn't look directly into her friend's eyes. "There's an internal investigation underway." Emily felt the world spin around her. "But David knows I'm a victim. We're working together to find out what was leaked." "Apparently, evidence has emerged that you may have acted deliberately. Robert said they found suspicious bank transfers to your account and email records that you supposedly sent with confidential information." Sarah finally raised her eyes, and Emily saw tears forming there. "Emily, I don't believe this, but they are going to fire you for cause today." Emily's legs buckled, and she leaned against the cold marble wall of the lobby. 5 years of dedication, impeccable work, absolute loyalty to the company, and now she was being accused of betrayal based on fabricated evidence. "Where is David? I need to talk to him." "He traveled to Washington, D.C. last night, family emergency. Robert took over the investigation in his absence." Robert Fields was the administrative director, a 60-year-old man who had always shown some antipathy towards employees who, in his opinion, received too much attention from the presidency. Emily had always suspected he saw her as a threat, especially after David began consulting her directly on some administrative processes. "Sarah, you need to help me. I need to talk to David. I need him to know what's happening here." "Emily, Sarah hesitated, and Emily noticed something strange in her expression. "I can't get involved in this. I have my own career to protect." Those words hurt more than any formal accusation could. Sarah had been her best friend for 3 years, the person she trusted most in the world after her mother. And now, at the moment she needed support the most, she was being abandoned again. "Miss Johnson," Robert's authoritative voice echoed through the hall. He was accompanied by 2 company security guards and carried a folder that Emily recognized as the type used for termination documentation. "I need you to come with me to the conference room." The process was quick and humiliating. Robert presented screenshots of emails that had apparently been sent from Emily's computer, bank statements showing deposits she swore she had never received, and even audio recordings that supposedly showed her discussing confidential information over the phone. Everything was false, she was sure of it, but the evidence was too convincing to be ignored by any formal investigation. "Miss Johnson, due to the seriousness of the accusations and the evidence presented, TechCorp is terminating your contract for cause, effective immediately." Robert showed no sign of neither satisfaction nor regret, just the bureaucratic coldness of someone fulfilling an unpleasant task. "You have 15 minutes to collect your personal belongings under the supervision of security." Emily signed the papers with trembling hands, feeling as if she were signing the death sentence of her own identity. Her desk, on the 15th floor, had never seemed so small and insignificant as it did at that moment, as she placed her personalized mug featuring a picture of Pandora, the little succulent she cared for religiously, and the picture frame with her college graduation photo next to her mother into a cardboard box. Her co-workers watched the scene in awkward silence. Some averted their gaze as she passed by, while others whispered in small groups. Emily felt like a wounded animal being expelled from its own pack. When she got home that afternoon, her apartment in East Village had never felt so cramped and dark. Pandora greeted her with worried meows, as if she could sense the despair radiating from her owner. Emily threw herself onto the 2-seater sofa she had bought with her first paycheck at TechCorp and finally allowed the tears to come. Her phone rang several times throughout the afternoon, unknown numbers she refused to answer. Probably journalists trying to get a statement about the scandal that would surely spread through the tech media. TechCorp was too big for an industrial espionage case to go unnoticed. It was only at 7 in the evening that she answered a call. Recognizing Michael's cell number, "Emily, where are you? I need to talk to you urgently." "At home." "I was fired today, Michael, for cause. Apparently, I'm now officially guilty of industrial espionage." "That's impossible." Jake left explicit instructions that you shouldn't be disturbed while he was away. Well, it seems Robert didn't get that message, or he did, and chose to ignore it. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Emily could hear Michael typing rapidly on his computer. "Emily, don't leave the house for any reason. I'm on my way now, and don't answer the door for anyone but me." Why? What else could happen? Because someone is escalating this situation very quickly, and you may be in real danger. The phone went silent, leaving Emily alone with Pandora, and a growing sense that her life had turned into a nightmare from which she couldn't wake up. She walked to the window of her apartment and watched the movement of the street below. New York City continued its frantic and indifferent life, oblivious to the fact that the life of one of its millions of inhabitants had just completely crumbled. 2 hours later, when Michael finally arrived, he was not alone. Jake had returned from Washington, D.C. early and was with him, wearing jeans and a simple T-shirt that made him look younger and more human than the business suit that was his trademark. "Emily," he said as soon as she opened the door, "I'm so sorry. This should never have happened." "So you believe me?" The question came laden with all the vulnerability she had tried to hide throughout the day. "Of course I believe you. And we will find out who did this to you, but first I need you to come with me. It's not safe for you to stay here." Jake drove his silver BMW through the streets of New York City with a noticeable tension in his shoulders, constantly checking the rearview mirror while Emily watched the city pass by through the passenger window. She had never been alone in his car before, and the intimate atmosphere contrasted drastically with the circumstances that had brought them there. The air conditioning blew softly, carrying the scent of leather from the seats mixed with the masculine cologne she had learned to associate with his presence. "Where are we going?" she asked, adjusting her seatbelt and noticing how her hands still trembled slightly since the conversation with Michael 2 hours earlier. "To my house. It's the safest place I can think of right now." Jake stopped at a red light on Fifth Avenue and finally looked directly at her. "Emily, I need you to understand that whoever is orchestrating this against you has resources and influence. The firing was just the first move." Jake's house was in a gated community in the Upper East Side, a modern 2-story building with impeccably maintained gardens and a security system that included cameras and electronic gates. As they passed through the gatehouse, Emily noticed that the security guards greeted him with a familiarity that suggested he always gave specific instructions about visitors. "Michael will be here in an hour," Jake said, as he disarmed the internal alarm system. The living room was spacious, decorated with modern furniture in neutral tones and contemporary American art that Emily recognized as being from famous artists. A whole wall was occupied by a bookshelf that revealed eclectic tastes. Business biographies shared space with classics of literature and studies on behavioral psychology. "Would you like some coffee? Water?" Jake seemed genuinely concerned about making her feel comfortable, a kindness that contrasted with the urgency of the situation. "Coffee would be nice." Emily sat down on a light leather sofa that probably cost more than her 3-month salary. "Jake, why are you doing this? Why are you protecting me?" He paused midway to the kitchen, as if the question had hit him unexpectedly. "Because it's the right thing to do." His answer came too quickly, too rehearsed, and they both noticed. "That's not all." Emily stood up and walked over to where he was standing. "You could have just let the investigation run its course, accepted the evidence against me, and moved on. But you're risking your own reputation to defend me." Jake studied her for a long moment. His dark eyes revealed an internal conflict he clearly wasn't used to sharing. "Since my father passed away and I took over the company, my life has become a series of tough decisions and personal sacrifices. I've gotten used to seeing people as resources, problems to be solved, or opportunities to be exploited. He paused, running his hand through his hair, in a gesture that Emily had learned to recognize as a sign of vulnerability. With you, it's different. I can't explain why, but it is. The silence that settled between them was broken by the doorbell. Michael had arrived, carrying a bulky briefcase and a grim expression that didn't bode well. "Let's sit," he said as soon as he entered, dismissing any greetings. "What I discovered today changes everything we knew about this case." They settled in the living room, with Michael spreading documents across the coffee table as if assembling a complex puzzle. First, all the evidence against Emily was fabricated. The emails were sent from a cloned computer. The bank deposits were made and reversed on the same day to create just a record in the statements, and the audio recordings were assembled using sophisticated digital manipulation techniques. "That's a relief," Emily sighed, feeling part of the tension leave her shoulders. "It shouldn't be," Michael continued gravely, "because it means someone with access to TechCorp's internal systems and considerable technological resources is determined to specifically destroy you." David leaned forward, studying the documents. "Did you find out who?" "I'm getting there. Second, Robert Fields received this evidence via anonymous email early yesterday morning, along with a tip-off that Emily was being inadequately protected by the presidency due to a personal relationship between you two." Emily felt her face flush. "What personal relationship? We never—" "I know that. You know that. But someone planted the idea in Robert's and other directors' heads that you are being favored for non-professional reasons." Michael looked directly at David. "And the timing of your trip to Washington, D.C. was very convenient for whoever wanted to get you out of the way." "The family emergency," David paled. "I got a call yesterday morning saying my mother had an accident. When I arrived at the hospital in Washington, D.C., I found out she was perfectly fine and that no accident had ever occurred. Someone orchestrated your absence specifically so that Emily could be fired without your protection," Michael concluded. "And third, the most disturbing part, I managed to trace the IP address of the anonymous emails sent to Robert." He opened his laptop and turned the screen so they could see a digital map of Los Angeles with a blinking red dot. The email was sent from a computer located in the TechCorp building, 16th floor, Human Resources Department. Emily felt as if she had been punched in the stomach. Sarah has access to all your personal data, knows your routines, knew about your meetings with Jake because you told her everything." Michael continued inexorably. "She also knew that you had developed a professional admiration for David in recent months." "I never said I admired him," Emily protested, but even as she spoke, she remembered casual conversations where she had commented on David's leadership, his dedication to the company, his intelligence in solving complex problems. For someone looking for vulnerabilities to exploit, that information was pure gold, David said quietly. "She gave Jake all the tools he needed to approach you convincingly." "But why?" Emily's voice cracked. "Sarah has been my friend for years. Why would she do this to me?" Michael consulted his notes. $15,000 deposited into your checking account last month, coming from a shell company controlled by Apex Innovations. The number echoed in the room like a death sentence for the friendship Emily considered one of the most precious things in her life. $15,000! Less than she earned in 3 months of honest work, but apparently enough to buy the betrayal of someone she considered her best friend. David stood up and walked to the window, observing the city lights stretching to the horizon. When he turned back to them, there was a steely determination in his eyes that Emily had never seen before. "Michael, I want you to keep investigating. I need to know if there are other compromised employees and what Apex Innovations' ultimate goal is." He looked directly at Emily. "And I want you to accept a proposal I'm going to make." "What proposal?" I want to hire you as a private consultant. Officially, you will help me review our internal security protocols. Unofficially, you will help me unmask this entire espionage network and recover your reputation. David, I don't know if... Emily, he interrupted, his voice laden with an intensity that made her heart race. You are the most loyal and competent person I know. And now you have personal motivation to uncover the truth. I can't do this alone. June arrived in Los Angeles with its characteristic drizzle and the unmistakable smell of roasted pine nuts wafting through the city corners during the summer festivities. Emily had temporarily moved into David's guest apartment in Beverly Hills, a decision she still didn't know was wise or just desperate. In the last 15 days working as his private consultant, she had uncovered layers of complexity in his personality that she had never imagined existed. Found anything? David entered the makeshift office they had set up on the ground floor of his house, carrying 2 steaming cups of coffee. It was 7 in the morning on a Friday, and they had already been working for 2 hours, analyzing old company documents that Michael had managed to recover from the digital archives. Maybe, Emily pointed to the computer screen, where she had opened a financial spreadsheet. From 1995. David, did you know that my father worked at TechCorp for almost 30 years? The coffee nearly slipped from his hands. Your father? You never mentioned that. Because I didn't know. Look here. She turned the screen so he could see better. Carlos Alberto Santos, accountant, hired in January 1994, terminated in March 1996. He died when I was 8 from a sudden heart attack. My mother always said he worked in accounting, but she never mentioned TechCorp specifically. David sat heavily in the chair next to her, studying the records with an expression that Emily couldn't decipher. 1995 was a complicated year for the company, he finally said. My father was expanding too quickly, making questionable partnerships. There were some administrative issues. What kind of issues? Irregular contracts, inadequately documented payments. Some suppliers we later found out were linked to illicit activities. David hesitated, clearly reluctant to continue. My father wasn't a bad man, Emily, but he was willing to do anything to make the company thrive. Emily felt a chill of foreboding. What are you trying to tell me? That maybe your father discovered something he shouldn't have? Before she could respond, her cell phone rang. It was Mrs. Johnson, her mother, calling from the apartment in East Village, where she had lived since becoming a widow. Hi, Mom. Honey, there are some men here wanting to talk to me about your father. They're asking about old documents, papers he might have left. I'm scared. Emily felt the blood run cold in her veins. What men? Did they identify themselves? They said they're private investigators, but they wouldn't show any documents. Emily, they know you're living somewhere else. They asked where you are. David was already on his feet, grabbing his car keys. Mrs. Johnson, he spoke, loud enough to be heard on the phone. You shouldn't say anything to them. Tell them I'm coming to get you in 20 minutes. Who is this man, Emily? He's my boss, Mom. Please trust me. Don't say anything about Dad until we get there. The drive to East Village was tense and silent. David drove with the controlled efficiency of someone used to managing crises, but Emily could see the tension in his jaw and the way his hands gripped the steering wheel. Emily, he said when they were stopped in traffic on the East River Drive, there's a possibility that what we're investigating is much bigger than simple industrial espionage. What do you mean? I mean that maybe someone is trying to cover up something that happened nearly 30 years ago, and you've become a threat because you inherited information from your father without even knowing it. Mrs. Johnson's apartment was on the 3rd floor of an old but well-maintained building. When they arrived, she was waiting for them at the window, clearly agitated. She was a 62-year-old woman, her grey hair always neatly styled, and the brown eyes that Emily had inherited. Despite her age, she maintained an upright posture and the determination of someone who had raised a daughter alone while working as a seamstress. "Mum, are these the documents the men wanted?" Emily pointed to a shoebox on the living room table, filled with yellowed papers. "Yes. I've always kept your father's papers, in case you ever needed them for any inheritance or pension matters." Mrs. Johnson looked suspiciously at David. "And who are you exactly?" "David Smith, Mum. I'm the president of the company where your daughter worked." He extended his hand with genuine cordiality that seemed to reassure the older woman. "We're trying to help Emily resolve some issues related to her work." Emily began to examine the papers in the box, employment contracts, old pay stubs, some handwritten notes she recognized as her father's handwriting. But it was at the bottom of the box that she found something that made her heart race. "David, look at this." It was a sealed envelope with a handwritten note on the outside. "For my daughter Emily, in case something happens to me. Open only if necessary." "Dad," Mrs. Johnson paled. I have never seen this envelope before. It must have been at the bottom of the box all these years." With trembling hands, Emily opened the envelope. Inside were 3 handwritten pages in her father's careful handwriting and a small key she didn't recognize. "My dear daughter," she began to read aloud, "if you are reading this letter, it is because something has happened to me, and it may be important for you to know the truth about my work at TechCorp. I discovered serious irregularities in the company's accounting books, involving contracts with ghost suppliers and misappropriation of funds from government projects. When I confronted my superior about this, I received veiled threats that something could happen to me or your mother if I spoke about what I discovered." David was pale, listening to every word with painful intensity. "I have kept copies of all the compromising documents in a safe deposit box at the Federal Reserve Bank Manhattan branch, safe deposit box number 247. This key gives access to the safe deposit box. If something happens to me, use this information to seek justice, but be very careful. The people involved have a lot of power and will not hesitate to use that power to protect themselves. I love you very much. Dad." The silence that settled in the room was broken only by the distant sound of traffic outside. Mrs. Johnson had tears in her eyes. "I always knew his death wasn't natural," she whispered. "A 42-year-old man, healthy, doesn't just have a heart attack out of nowhere. But the doctors said these things happen, and I was just a widow without resources to question." David stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the street below. When he turned back, there was a steely determination in his eyes. "Emily, your life is in danger. Much more danger than we imagined." His voice was controlled, but she could sense the underlying tension. "Whoever is behind this won't hesitate to do to you what they did to your father." "Then let's go to the bank tomorrow," Emily said, surprised by the firmness in her own voice. "We will find out what my father was trying to protect." "No," David shook his head. "We're going to the bank today. Now. Every hour we wait is another hour for them to realize you have this information." The Federal Reserve Bank was an imposing building that exuded history and formality. Emily held the small golden key so tightly that her hands ached when they finally gained access to the basement where the private safes were located. David had used his business influence to expedite the bureaucratic process, but it still took nearly 3 hours to obtain the necessary authorizations, considering the original holder had been dead for almost 20 years. "Safe deposit box 247, murmured the elderly employee accompanying them. his keys jingling as he walked down the narrow corridor lined with small numbered metal doors. This safe hasn't been accessed in a long time, a very long time. When the small door opened with a metallic click, it revealed a compact space filled with folders organized with the same precision that Emily had inherited from her father. There was also an old cassette tape and an additional letter addressed to whomever finds these documents. "Can we take everything?" David asked the employee. "Yes, sir. With the documentation you provided, the daughter has legal rights to all the contents." They carried the materials to the car in tense silence, both aware that every document in that folder could change their lives forever. It was only when they returned to David's house late in the afternoon that Emily had the courage to open the first folder. "David, sit here next to me," she said, settling onto the sofa in the living room. "If this involves your family's history and the company, you need to see this with me." The documents were organized chronologically, and the story they told was more sinister than either of them had imagined. Charles Anderson had uncovered a complex money laundering scheme that used TechCorp as a front company to legitimize funds of criminal origin. "Look here," Emily pointed to a handwritten spreadsheet in her father's meticulous handwriting. "Fictitious contracts with the company Advanced Tech Solutions for astronomical amounts for the time. $2 million a month for services that were never rendered." David studied the documents with an expression that mixed horror and recognition. "Advanced Tech Solutions, that name sounds familiar." "It should. According to these papers, its majority partner was Arthur Mitchell." "My father's partner," David murmured, the color draining from his face. "The man who helped me take over the company after my dad died. The man I trust most in the business world." Emily picked up the additional letter and began to read. "To whomever it may concern, my name is Charles Anderson, and I am documenting a criminal scheme of which I have become an involuntary witness. Arthur Mitchell, partner of TechCorp, is using the company to launder money from drug trafficking and political corruption. When I confronted Edward Smith, David's father, about my findings, I discovered he was being blackmailed to allow these operations. Arthur has compromising information about minor irregularities that Edward committed at the start of the company and uses it to maintain control over him." "My father was being blackmailed," David repeated, as if he needed to hear the words aloud to believe them. He wasn't a willing accomplice. "There's more." Emily turned the page. "Edward reached out to me desperately last week, saying that Arthur was escalating the operations and that he could no longer handle the pressure. He said he was going to confess everything, accept the consequences, and report Arthur to the authorities. 3 days later, Edward died in a car accident that the police deemed suspicious but never properly investigated due to Arthur's political influence." The silence that settled between them was laden with an almost palpable pain. David had discovered not only that his father had been murdered, but that the man he considered a mentor had been responsible. "I know I am next," Emily continued reading. "Arthur cannot allow me to remain alive knowing what I know. If something happens to me, I hope these documents can bring justice for both Edward and me. I apologize to my wife and daughter for the danger I have put them in, but some truths are too important to die with me." Emily picked up the cassette tape, and David brought an old recorder from the office. Her father's voice, which she hadn't heard in almost 20 years, echoed through the room with ghostly clarity. Date, March 15th, 1996. "This is a recording of a conversation between me, Charles Anderson, and Arthur Mitchell, who does not know he is being recorded." The recording that followed lasted 14 minutes and confirmed all the accusations in the written documents. Arthur explicitly confessed to the murder of Edward Smith, directly threatened Charles Anderson, and outlined plans to expand the criminal operations using TechCorp's reputation. The company I have run for 10 years was built on the blood of my father and yours, David said, his voice heavy with an emotion he was clearly struggling to control. And now Arthur has discovered that the daughter of the accountant who threatened his secrets is working at the company, Emily added. That's why all this elaborate scheme with Jake, with the industrial espionage. He wasn't just trying to steal information from the company, he was trying to neutralize me before I discovered the truth about my father. David stood up and began to pace the room, as he always did when processing complex information. Emily, this also explains why you were fired so quickly. Arthur must have pressured Robert. He might even be paying him. And Sarah? She probably doesn't even know she's being used for something much bigger than she realizes. To her, it must just seem like an opportunity to make some extra cash by passing along a few pieces of information. Emily looked at the documents spread across the table. The table was covered with papers, each representing years of meticulous investigation and the courage of her father. David, do you realize what this means? Arthur killed your father and mine to protect a criminal scheme that probably continues to this day. And now he knows we know. David stopped walking and looked directly at her. Emily, do you understand that our lives are in real danger? This man has already killed 2 people to protect his secrets. He won't hesitate to kill 2 more. So, what do? We do what our parents couldn't do. We take this evidence to the right authorities and put Arthur Mitchell behind bars. David sat back down beside her, taking her hands in his. But first, I need to tell you something I discovered about myself during these last few weeks. What? That I fell in love with you, he said, his voice low but firm, and that I can't bear the thought of losing you too. Before Emily could respond, the lights in the room went out, leaving them in almost complete darkness. Outside, the sound of cars parking and doors closing suggested they were no longer alone in the house. David, Emily whispered, I think Arthur found out where we are. The winter chill had arrived with all its characteristic melancholy. The fine drizzle falling over the city that July night created a gloomy atmosphere that seemed to echo the fear growing in Emily's chest. She and David were crouched behind the living room sofa, listening to the cautious footsteps of at least 3 people who had invaded the garden of the house. Is there a back exit? Emily whispered, trying to control the tremor in her voice. Yes, but they probably already surrounded the house. David grabbed his phone, but the screen remained black. They're blocking the signal. This isn't the work of amateurs. The sound of glass breaking came from the kitchen, confirming that the invasion had begun. David grabbed Emily's hand and silently pulled her toward the office, where he knew there was a door leading to the garage. The documents, Emily whispered, looking back at the table where they had left all the evidence against Arthur. Leave it. Our lives are worth more than paper. But Emily had already slipped out of his grip and was running back to the living room. In desperate movements, she stuffed all the documents and the cassette tape into a gym bag that was near the sofa. When she turned to return to David, a tall, muscular man blocked her path. Miss, you're not going anywhere. His voice had a rural accent and a tone that suggested violence would not be a problem for him. Emily could see 2 other men methodically searching the upper floor of the house. Where's Smith? The man asked, taking a step toward her. I don't know what you're talking about. Emily pressed the bag against her chest, trying to appear braver than she felt. It was then that she heard the sound of an engine starting in the garage. David had managed to reach the car and was creating a distraction for her to escape. The man in front of her looked confused for a moment, turning his head toward the sound. Emily seized the opportunity to run toward the kitchen, but she tripped over the coffee table and fell, scattering some documents on the floor. The man quickly caught up to her, grabbing her arm with enough force to leave marks. "You're coming with me, miss. Someone wants to have a word with you." It was at that moment that the front lights of the house turned on and the electronic gate began to open automatically. David's BMW sped out of the garage, but instead of fleeing, he made a tight turn and headed back toward the main entrance of the house. The man holding Emily spoke something into his radio, clearly irritated by the unexpected turn of events. That was enough for her to break free and run toward the front door, which David had strategically left open. "Get in the car, now!" David shouted, keeping the engine running as she threw herself into the passenger seat. They sped out of the condominium, with David constantly checking the rearview mirror to see if they were being followed. Only when they reached Beverly Hills did he slow down and allow them both to breathe again. "Where are we going?" Emily asked, still trembling from the adrenaline. "To the only place I know will be temporarily safe. Michael has a secure apartment in Brooklyn that he uses for situations like this." Michael's apartment was on the top floor of a discreet residential building overlooking the bohemian neighborhood that Emily knew well from growing up in the area. It was small, functional, with simple furniture and a security system that included cameras at all access points. "You guys arrived sooner than I expected," Michael said when he greeted them at the door, already wearing a bulletproof vest. "Arthur is escalating things very quickly." "How did you know we were in danger?" David asked, as he helped Emily sit on the sofa. "Because I intercepted a conversation of his 2 hours ago, ordering that they deal with the Smith problem once and for all." Michael opened his laptop and showed them a digital recording. "He knows you have evidence against him and is willing to use any means necessary to get it back." Emily opened the bag she had managed to save and spread the documents over the coffee table. "Michael, you need to see this. It's not just industrial espionage. Arthur killed David's father and my father nearly 20 years ago." Michael examined the documents with the efficiency of someone used to analyzing complex evidence. When he finished listening to the cassette tape, his expression had turned grim. "This changes everything," he finally said. "We're no longer dealing with corporate crime. This is homicide, money laundering, and probably a criminal organization much broader than we imagined." "What does that mean for us?" Emily asked. "It means you can't go to the regular police. Jake has too much political influence. He might have police officers and prosecutors on his payroll." Michael stood up and began pacing the room. "But it also means we have enough evidence to interest the federal prosecutor's office and the FBI. And in the meantime?" David was clearly struggling to keep calm. "While we wait for federal justice to act, is Jake going to keep trying to kill us? That's why you're here. This apartment is safe for at least 48 hours. Enough time for me to contact the right people and arrange official protection for you." Emily stood up and walked to the window, watching the lights of Brooklyn spread across the night landscape. The neighborhood where she had grown up, where she felt safe, now seemed filled with invisible threats. "Emily," David approached her, speaking softly so Michael wouldn't hear, "about what I said before we were interrupted. David, now is not the time for that." But even as she spoke, she could feel the warmth of his presence and the sincerity in his words still echoing in her mind. "Maybe this is exactly the time for it," he insisted. "If something happens to us, I want you to know that these last few months, working with you, getting to know who you really are, have been the best of my life." Emily turned to face him, seeing real vulnerability in his eyes for the first time since they had known each other. "David—" "Sorry to interrupt." Michael appeared beside them. "But we have a problem. I just received information that Sarah was found dead in her apartment an hour ago, apparently suicide." The shock of the news hit Emily like a physical blow. Even knowing Sarah's betrayal, she had been her best friend for years. The idea that she was dead, likely murdered by Jake to eliminate a witness, brought a brutal reality to the situation. "He's eliminating all traces," David said grimly. "Everyone who can link him to the scheme." "Which means," Michael added, "that you two are next on the list." September brought to Los Angeles the unmistakable scent of blooming jacarandas, their violet petals covering the sidewalks like a natural carpet that dramatically contrasted with the tension dominating Emily's life for the past 2 months. She and David had been under federal protection for 8 weeks, living in a safe house in the southern part of the city, waiting for the federal Lava Jato operation to complete its investigation into Jake's criminal network. "Emily, there's someone here to see you," announced the federal agent responsible for their security, a serious man named Rodrigo, who had become almost a friend during their forced seclusion. She was in the small backyard garden of the house, trying to find some normalcy by tending to the plants that had become her therapy during those endless days of waiting. When she turned around, she almost dropped the watering can upon seeing who was at the door. Jake. It was him, but completely different from the man she had known months ago. He looked thinner, with a recent scar on the right side of his face, and an expression in his eyes that revealed someone who had gone through traumatic experiences. "Hi, Emily. I know you weren't expecting to see me again." David appeared behind him, clearly tense. "Agent Rodrigo said he has important information about Jake, information that could change the whole case." "You can speak in front of him," Jake said, looking at David. "Actually, it's better that he hears it too, since it involves his family." They sat in the small backyard, with Rodrigo strategically positioned to observe all access points. Jake seemed nervous, as if he was still processing difficult decisions. "Emily, I need to start by apologizing. I know this doesn't undo what I did, but you deserve to know the whole truth." He paused, running his hand over the scar on his face. "My real name is Robert Fields, and I am a private investigator. That is true. But it wasn't Apex Innovations that initially hired me." "Who was it then?" David leaned forward, clearly intrigued. "It was Jake Mendonça. 6 months ago, he approached me with a story that there were suspicions that employees of TechCorp were leaking information to competitors. He wanted me to investigate, specifically focusing on you, Emily." "Why specifically me?" "Because he found out who your father was. Jake has a dossier on every employee at the company, especially those who have access to sensitive information. When your name came up as the daughter of Charles Anderson, the accountant that he had killed in 1996, he panicked." Emily felt her blood run cold. "He always knew who I was." "Yes, but initially, he believed you didn't know anything about your father's past. The plan was just to get close to you, confirm that you had no knowledge of the old irregularities, and then close the operation." "But something changed," David observed. "Exactly. When I started investigating, I discovered things about Jake that he didn't expect me to find out. I realized I wasn't investigating a leak of information. I was being used to set the stage to eliminate a potential witness." Robert stood up and began pacing the small yard, clearly agitated. "That's when Apex Innovations came into play. They really exist. They are real competitors of TechCorp, and when they found out I was investigating the company, they made me an offer. They would pay me to actually steal information that I was already collecting. Did you accept?" "Initially, yes. It seemed like an easy way to make money from both sides. But then He looked directly at Emily. "I started to really care about you." The silence that settled was heavy with complex emotions. Emily felt anger, confusion, and a pang of something she didn't want to recognize as relief. "What happened in Yosemite was—" "Really, Emily, I didn't abandon you. I was kidnapped by Arthur's men on the first night. They found out I was questioning orders, investigating too much, asking questions about 1996. I spent the last 4 months in captivity. How did you escape? David asked. I didn't escape. I was released 3 days ago by direct order from the federal prosecutor's office. Apparently Arthur made the mistake of keeping me alive because he still hoped to use me somehow against you. Robert pulled a folder from inside his jacket. During my captivity, I heard a lot of things I shouldn't have. Conversations about other homicides, about corrupt politicians, about a much larger network than any of us imagined. He opened the folder, revealing photographs, transcribed recordings, and a list of names that made David pale. Emily, Arthur didn't just kill our parents. He is responsible for at least 8 deaths in the last 20 years. All people who discovered things about his criminal operations. And there's more, Robert continued. He wasn't working alone. He had a partner, someone you know well. Who? Emily asked, although part of her already suspected the answer. Robert Fernandez, the director who fired you. They have been partners for years. The firing was orchestrated specifically to isolate you, so you would lose the protection David was offering. David stood up abruptly, clearly outraged. Robert has worked with me for 10 years. I trusted him with important decisions, with confidential information. And he passed everything to Arthur, Robert finished, including your investigation plans, your suspicions, even details about where you were hiding. The realization hit everyone at once. If Robert Fernandez knew where they were, the safe house was no longer safe. Agent Roberts, David called, but the man was no longer at his observation post. He left 5 minutes ago, Robert said, and his voice carried a new tone of urgency. He said he received an emergency call. It was at that moment they heard the sound of cars approaching quickly to the house, followed by the unmistakable noise of gates slamming. They found us, Emily whispered. No, Robert said, checking his weapon. I brought them here. The confusion on Emily's face was immediate. What? Emily, I worked 4 months to get to this moment. Arthur and Robert Fernandez are coming here personally to take care of you once and for all. But what they don't know is that this house has been surrounded by federal agents for 2 hours. Through the living room window, they could see Arthur Mitchell, a man in his 60s with gray hair and an imposing presence, getting out of a black car accompanied by Robert Fernandez and 3 armed men. It's now, Robert said into the small communicator he took from his pocket. All targets confirmed on sight. The next 2 hours were a confusion of sirens, shouts, gunfire, and arrests. When the dust finally settled, Arthur Mitchell and Robert Fernandez were handcuffed, being taken to federal police vehicles. Emily was sitting on the steps of the safe house, still processing that the nightmare was finally over when Robert approached her one last time. Emily, I know what I did was unforgivable, but I want you to know that my feelings for you were real, if circumstances were different. Robert, she gently interrupted him, thank you for helping us bring justice for our parents. But you're right, what you did was unforgivable. I hope you find a way to rebuild your life away from all this. He nodded, understanding the final farewell, and walked away toward the federal agents waiting for him for further testimony. David sat down next to Emily on the steps, both watching the activity that would finally put a definitive end to the crimes that had destroyed their families decades ago. It's over, he said simply. Yes, she agreed, feeling an immense weight lift from her shoulders. It's finally over. 6 months later, on a sunny afternoon in March 2025, Emily Johnson was sitting in her new office at TechCorp on the 21st floor of the building on Faria Lima. The sign on the door read, Emily Johnson, Director of Information Security, a position created especially for her after the whole truth about Arthur Mitchell's criminal scheme came to light. Through the panoramic window, she could see the carnival blocks still parading through the streets of Saum, E Paolo that March Sunday, filling the city with music and joy. Executive chat at 3 in the afternoon on a carnival Sunday. David appeared at the door of her office, carrying 2 cups of coffee and wearing a casual polo shirt that made him look younger and more relaxed than the usual business suits. Is that dedication or workaholism? A bit of both, Emily laughed, saving the quarterly report she was finishing on the computer. But mostly it's gratitude for having a job that really matters. In the last 6 months, she had transformed TechCorp's security department into a national reference. Her personal experience as a victim of industrial espionage, combined with her exceptional memory for details and her natural dedication to work, had resulted in security protocols that other companies were now copying. How was the testimony on Thursday? David sat in the chair across from her desk, a dynamic that had become natural between them, not superior and subordinate, not just colleagues, but something they were still figuring out how to define. Arthur was sentenced to 22 years in prison. Robert Fernandez got 15 years, and the judge ordered that all of Arthur's assets be used to compensate the victims' families. Emily paused, feeling a mix of relief and melancholy. My mother will finally receive the pension she should have gotten 20 years ago, and a compensation that will allow her to stop working. And you? How do you feel knowing that justice has been served? Relieved, but also sad, you know. My father and the... She will never come back. Sarah will never come back. Justice doesn't undo the pain, it just makes it more bearable. Jake stood up and walked to the window, watching the crowds on the streets below. When he turned back, there was something different in his expression. Emily, there's something I need to tell you. I received an offer from a German company. They want me to take over as president of the Brazilian branch of a multinational technology firm. Emily felt her heart twist uncomfortably. Is it a good opportunity? It's an incredible opportunity. A salary 3 times higher, the chance to work with cutting-edge technology, travel all over the world. He hesitated, as if the next words were hard to say. But it would mean leaving Los Angeles, leaving TechCorp, leaving you. The silence that settled between them was heavy with all the things that had gone unsaid during the months of investigation, trial, and rebuilding their lives. You should accept, Emily finally said, surprising herself with the firmness in her voice. It's a unique opportunity. Even if it means we might not see each other again. Jake, throughout all these months, since everything started, you sacrificed your own career to protect me. You risked your reputation, your company, even your life. It's time for you to think about what's best for you. And what if what's best for me isn't a promotion or a higher salary? He walked back to her desk, resting his hands on the glass surface and looking directly into her eyes. What if what's best for me is to stay here? Transform TechCorp into an even better company and build a life alongside the bravest, smartest, and most loyal woman I've ever known. Emily felt tears burning in her eyes. Jake, Emily, I fell in love with you long before I understood what was happening. I fell in love with how dedicated you are to everything you do. Your ability to find strength even when everything is falling apart, the way you put the people you love before yourself. He walked around the desk and knelt beside her chair. And I fell in love with how you see me, not as the successful CEO or the heir to the company, but as Jake, just Jake. I fell in love with you too, she said, allowing the tears to finally fall. But I'm scared. Scared of what? Scared that this started in such a traumatic situation that it might not be real. Scared that you feel obligated to take care of me out of guilt. Scared of... She hesitated. Scared of trusting again. Jake took her hands in his. Emily, look at me. What do you feel when you look at me? She studied him, the brown eyes that had learned to read her emotions better than she could herself, the small scar on his forehead he had gotten the night they escaped the house in Beverly Hills, the way his lips curved when he was worried about her. "I feel at home," she admitted. "I feel like I can be completely myself, including the broken and scared parts, and you'll still be here. So will you marry me?" The question came so naturally that it took a moment for Emily to process what he had said. When she did, she realized he was holding a small blue velvet box. "Jake, are you sure? We've been through so much trauma together. Are you sure this isn't just—" "Emily Johnson," he interrupted, opening the box to reveal a simple yet elegant engagement ring. "Will you marry me?" The answer came from her heart before her mind could create more objections. "Yes." The ring fit perfectly on her finger, as if it had been made just for her. When Jake kissed her there, on the 21st floor with the sounds of Mardi Gras echoing below, Emily felt that she was finally complete. 2 years later, TechCorp would be recognized as the Brazilian company with the best digital security protocols in the country. Emily would have developed a training program that helped other companies protect themselves against industrial espionage, turning her traumatic experience into a tool to protect others. Jake turned down the offer from the German company and, together with Emily, transformed TechCorp into one of the most ethical and successful companies in the Brazilian tech sector. They married in a small ceremony at the church where Emily had been baptized, with Mrs. Johnson crying tears of joy in the front row. But all of that was still in the future. On that Sunday of Mardi Gras in March 2025, they were just two people who had found love amidst chaos, who had discovered that sometimes the greatest tragedies can lead to the greatest transformations, and that justice and love, when they walk together, can truly heal even the deepest wounds. Outside, Los Angeles continued its colorful and noisy celebration, oblivious to the fact that on the 21st floor of a commercial building, two people were rewriting the ending of a story that had begun with abandonment and betrayal, but was ending with love, justice, and the promise that together they could face anything the future might bring.